You ever meet a soul so broken, even its silence feels loud? That was Bruno, a dog no one dared to touch, until a little girl with quiet eyes sat down beside him, and never left. Their bond didn't start with words, it started with trust. If stories like this warm your heart, go ahead and give this video a like. Maybe subscribe to join us for more, and stay with me, because what happened next might just change how you see love forever. The next morning brought a gentle hush over Elkridge. Snow dusted the rooftops, and the streets shimmered with early frost, as if the entire town had been blanketed in calm. Hollow Creek Shelter was quieter than usual, too. The usual barking had dulled, and staff moved a little slower, careful not to disturb the lingering tension around Kennel 9. But something had shifted overnight, and everyone could feel it, like the way a thunderstorm leaves behind a silence charged with change. Inside the break room, a few staff members were sipping coffee, exchanging half-whispered theories about Bruno. Mark, the young volunteer with the shaggy blonde hair, scratched his chin and said, "He didn't tear up his blankets last night. I peeked in. He just laid there." Rachel overheard the conversation as she filled out medication logs by the window. She didn't say anything. Instead, she glanced toward the hallway where the kennels lined up in 2 rows and wondered if what she'd seen last night had really happened, or if she'd imagined it. Bruno, resting, still, with the empty peanut butter jar by his side. Ella arrived shortly after 8, her school bag slung over one shoulder and a thick scarf bundled around her neck. Her boots were scuffed, and her hair was slightly tangled under a knit beanie, but her eyes were bright, more alert than usual. As Rachel checked the animal charts, Ella quietly made her way down the corridor, holding something in her mittened hands. This time, it wasn't just peanut butter. It was a small, folded piece of construction paper light blue, the kind used in elementary art projects. She stopped outside Bruno's kennel, crouched, and without crossing the yellow line, slid the note under the bars. The dog was already awake, lying down again, but not sleeping. His ears twitched at the sound of paper brushing against concrete, and his amber eyes flicked toward her. Ella didn't speak. She just smiled a little and sat down, cross-legged, as she had the day before. Behind her, Rachel approached slowly. "What did you give him?" she asked gently, crouching beside her daughter. "A drawing," Ella whispered. "It's him, with a heart above." Rachel's gaze moved to the folded paper, now near Bruno's paws. She expected him to tear it, ignore it, maybe push it away with his snout. But instead, he nudged it gently, nose brushing its edge. Then, for a brief second, he looked at Ella, not with fear or suspicion, but with something else. Curiosity, maybe. Recognition. Something that flickered across his expression before retreating again. Bruno didn't move any closer, but he didn't growl either. Over the next few days, the rhythm continued. Ella would come after school and sit quietly by Bruno's cage, sometimes reading aloud from her school books, other times humming under her breath or simply sitting in silence. Rachel began to notice how the dog responded, how the sound of Ella's footsteps made his ears perk before she even appeared around the corner, how he waited for her even if he ignored everyone else. Other staff members began to take notice too. Sarah, the shelter manager, observed from a distance. "She's got something," she said to Rachel one evening, arms folded, her voice softer than usual. "That girl of yours, she's doing something none of us could." "I don't think she's doing," Rachel replied. "I think she's just being." By the end of the week, Bruno had stopped destroying his bedding. He hadn't growled in 3 days. He still didn't allow anyone to enter his space, and he would stiffen if someone got too close. But his breathing changed when Ella sat nearby. It became slower, steadier. On Saturday, a new face entered the shelter. Nina Carver, a recently hired behavioral specialist, called in from Boulder to assess Bruno's situation. She was in her mid-40s, tall and lean, with a no-nonsense presence, short-cropped gray hair, and piercing green eyes. She wore a navy parka, practical boots, and carried a clipboard she barely looked up from during her first half hour on site. Rachel met her near the intake desk. "You've worked with trauma cases before?" 15 years in shelters, another 5 in military dog rehabilitation, Nina replied curtly. "I've seen worse. Let's see your worst." When Nina reached Kennel 9, she stopped in her tracks. Bruno was sitting upright, not aggressive, but tense alert. Nina studied him, taking slow steps, her body language neutral and low to the ground. Bruno's eyes locked onto her. "Interesting posture," Nina murmured. "He's not in defense. He's in grief." That was the first time anyone at Hollow Creek had said it aloud. Later that afternoon, as Ella sat again outside the kennel, Nina pulled up a folding chair across the corridor and observed. Notebooks untouched, no interruption, just watching. "She's his mirror," Nina said to Rachel, not taking her eyes off the pair. "Whatever happened to that dog, she reflects it back without fear. It's rare." "She doesn't speak much at school," Rachel said, folding her arms. "She's been through a lot." Nina glanced at her. "What happened?" Rachel hesitated, then said, "Her father left when she was 5, just packed and never came back. Since then, she doesn't talk to adults much, especially men, but she never stopped talking to animals." Bruno, now lying with his chin resting near the paper drawing, didn't seem to notice he was the center of this quiet storm of concern. Or perhaps he did, and simply didn't care, as long as Ella was there. That evening, after closing hours, Rachel did one last round. Snow was beginning to fall again, thick flakes settling against the shelter's old windows. As she passed Kennel 9, she saw something that made her stop cold. Bruno was asleep, truly asleep, for the first time since his arrival. His body was not rigid, his limbs were tucked in, and his breathing was deep and slow. And beside him, barely a breath away, lay Ella's drawing, now slightly crumpled but untouched. It was the first night the shelter lights dimmed with hope instead of dread. The next morning brought a gentle hush over Elkridge. Snow dusted the rooftops, and the streets shimmered with early frost, as if the entire town had been blanketed in calm. Hollow Creek shelter was quieter than usual, too. The usual barking had dulled, and staff moved a little slower, careful not to disturb the lingering tension around Kennel 9. But something had shifted overnight, and everyone could feel it, like the way a thunderstorm leaves behind a silence charged with change. Inside the break room, a few staff members were sipping coffee, exchanging half-whispered theories about Bruno. Mark, the young volunteer with the shaggy blonde hair, scratched his chin and said, "He didn't tear up his blankets last night. I peeked in. He just laid there." Rachel overheard the conversation as she filled out medication logs by the window. She didn't say anything. Instead, she glanced toward the hallway where the kennels lined up in 2 rows and wondered if what she'd seen last night had really happened, or if she'd imagined it. Bruno, resting. Still. With the empty peanut butter jar by his side. Ella arrived shortly after 8, her school bag slung over one shoulder and a thick scarf bundled around her neck. Her boots were scuffed and her hair was slightly tangled under a knit beanie, but her eyes were bright, more alert than usual. As Rachel checked the animal charts, Ella quietly made her way down the corridor, holding something in her mittened hands. This time, it wasn't just peanut butter. It was a small folded piece of construction paper light blue, the kind used in elementary art projects. She stopped outside Bruno's kennel, crouched, and without crossing the yellow line, slid the note under the bars. The dog was already awake, lying down again but not sleeping. His ears twitched at the sound of paper brushing against concrete, and his amber eyes flicked toward her. Ella didn't speak. She just smiled a little and sat down, cross-legged, as she had the day before. Behind her, Rachel approached slowly. "What did you give him?" she asked gently, crouching beside her daughter. "A drawing," Ella whispered. "It's him, with a heart above." Rachel's gaze moved to the folded paper now near Bruno's paws. She expected him to tear it, ignore it, maybe push it away with his snout. But instead, he nudged it gently, nose brushing its edge. Then, for a brief second, he looked at Ella not with fear or suspicion, but with something else. Curiosity, maybe. Recognition. Something that flickered across his expression before retreating again. Bruno didn't move any closer, but he didn't growl either. Over the next few days, the rhythm continued. Ella would come after school and sit quietly by Bruno's cage, sometimes reading aloud from her school books. Other times humming under her breath, or simply sitting in silence. Rachel began to notice how the dog responded, how the sound of Ella's footsteps made his ears perk before she even appeared around the corner, how he waited for her, even if he ignored everyone else. Other staff members began to take notice too. Sarah, the shelter manager, observed from a distance. "She's got something," she said to Rachel one evening, arms folded, her voice softer than usual. "That girl of yours? She's doing something none of us could." "I don't think she's doing," Rachel replied. "I think she's just being." By the end of the week, Bruno had stopped destroying his bedding. He hadn't growled in 3 days. He still didn't allow anyone to enter his space, and he would stiffen if someone got too close. But his breathing changed when Ella sat nearby. It became slower, steadier. On Saturday, a new face entered the shelter. Nina Carver, a recently hired behavioral specialist, called in from Boulder to assess Bruno's situation. She was in her mid-40s, tall and lean, with a no-nonsense presence, short-cropped gray hair, and piercing green eyes. She wore a navy parka, practical boots, and carried a clipboard she barely looked up from during her first half hour on site. Rachel met her near the intake desk. "You've worked with trauma cases before?" 15 years in shelters, another 5 in military dog rehabilitation, Nina replied curtly. "I've seen worse. Let's see your worst." When Nina reached Kennel 9, she stopped in her tracks. Bruno was sitting upright, not aggressive, but tense alert. Nina studied him, taking slow steps, her body language neutral and low to the ground. Bruno's eyes locked onto her. "Interesting posture," Nina murmured. "He's not in defense. He's in grief." That was the first time anyone at Hollow Creek had said it aloud. Later that afternoon, as Ella sat again outside the kennel, Nina pulled up a folding chair across the corridor and observed. Notebooks untouched, no interruption, just watching. "She's his mirror," Nina said to Rachel, not taking her eyes off the pair. "Whatever happened to that dog, she reflects it back without fear. It's rare." "She doesn't speak much at school," Rachel said, folding her arms. "She's been through a lot." Nina glanced at her. "What happened?" Rachel hesitated, then said, "Her father left when she was 5, just packed and never came back. Since then she doesn't talk to adults much, especially men, but she never stopped talking to animals." Bruno, now lying with his chin resting near the paper drawing, didn't seem to notice he was the center of this quiet storm of concern. Or perhaps he did, and simply didn't care, as long as Ella was there. That evening, after closing hours, Rachel did one last round. Snow was beginning to fall again, thick flakes settling against the shelter's old windows. As she passed Kennel 9, she saw something that made her stop cold. Bruno was asleep, truly asleep, for the first time since his arrival. His body was not rigid, his limbs were tucked in, and his breathing was deep and slow. And beside him, barely a breath away, lay Ella's drawing, now slightly crumpled but untouched. It was the first night the shelter lights dimmed with hope instead of dread. It was a Wednesday afternoon in Elkridge, and the sun had finally emerged after days of heavy snow. The shelter's parking lot shimmered with melting frost, and a gentle mist hovered above the thawing earth. Inside Hollow Creek, warmth lingered in the form of quiet routines, fresh hay being laid, food bowls clinking, the low murmur of radio static. But something deeper hummed beneath the surface, a sense that change, real and slow and certain, was taking root in Kennel 9. Ella arrived straight from school, her cheeks still pink from the cold, and a small smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. In her gloved hands, she carried something carefully wrapped in a napkin. As she walked toward the kennels, the staff glanced up and gave quiet nods. Over the past week, they'd come to see her not just as Rachel's daughter, but as part of the shelter's rhythm, a quiet, steady presence like snowfall. Bruno was already standing when she entered the corridor, not barking, not growling, just watching. His thick tail remained low, but gave a single, slow wag. The jagged scars on his sides still caught the light like broken glass, but his eyes had softened. They followed Ella with unspoken recognition. Ella knelt by the yellow line and slowly unwrapped the napkin, revealing a dog biscuit in the shape of a bone, clumsily decorated with pink icing. She'd made it herself, with Rachel's help, the night before. She didn't say much, just slid it gently near the kennel bars. "This is for you," she whispered. "It's not much, but I made it with both hands." Bruno sniffed the treat. Then, instead of snapping it up, he sat, blinking at her slowly. Ella took that as permission. She reached into her backpack and pulled out a small blue envelope. Inside was a folded card, another drawing. This time, it was a scene Bruno, standing in a field under a tree, with Ella sitting nearby, both of them smiling. Rachel had seen the drawing earlier that morning. It was messy in the way only a child's love could be, bright colors, crooked lines, but deeply sincere. She hadn't questioned it. She'd simply kissed Ella's head and said, "I think he'll love it." Nearby, Nina Carver leaned against the corridor wall, arms crossed. She'd stayed in town longer than planned, sensing something rare in this story unfolding. Her usual tough shell built, from years of dealing with aggressive cases and bureaucracy, had softened, even if her tone hadn't. She watched everything, every shift in posture, every blink from Bruno, every word from Ella. "Most animals respond to routine," she said to Sarah, who stood beside her, arms folded tightly. "But this is relational. He's bonding, selectively, with her." Sarah, whose expression was more reserved than skeptical, replied, "And that scares me. Because what happens if we break it?" "You don't," Nina said simply. "You follow it." Bruno nosed the envelope, then lay down slowly, his paws touching the paper but not crushing it. He rested his chin beside it and closed his eyes, not fully asleep, but resting. Calm. His breathing was rhythmic. Rachel stepped closer to Nina. "He's eating better too. Not when we're in the room, but the bowls are always empty now. And he's not tearing up his bed anymore." "He's still not safe to enter," Nina warned. "Let's not mistake progress for transformation, but this is the path." That evening, Ella stayed a little longer than usual. She began to hum softly, a lullaby her grandmother used to sing, a slow, wordless melody that sounded like wind through tall grass. Bruno listened, his ears twitched, then settled. Just then, a knock echoed at the shelter's front entrance. Rachel went to check, returning moments later with a man who looked out of place against the warmth of the building. His name was Tobias Finch, a county inspector in his early 60s, balding with a weathered face and a stiff posture. He wore a regulation jacket and carried a clipboard under one arm. His voice was flat, professional. "I'm here to conduct the monthly compliance review," he said. "I also received an anonymous report about a Class C aggressive case not being scheduled for transfer." Rachel tensed. Sarah stepped forward calmly. "You're referring to Bruno?" Tobias nodded. "The dog's file lists multiple aggression incidents. If he's not adoptable, he should be moved to a state facility equipped for long-term containment, or evaluated for euthanasia, per protocol." Nina's jaw clenched. "With respect, he's being monitored by a qualified specialist, and he's made measurable behavioral progress in the past 7 days." Tobias raised an eyebrow. "Progress doesn't change protocol. I'll need to observe the dog myself." Rachel's voice was firm. "Then you observe from behind glass." When Tobias approached the observation window, Bruno stood immediately, hackles up, body tense. The change was instant. His eyes darkened, growl low and guttural. But then, from the corner, Ella's voice cut through. "Bruno," she said. One word, gentle, steady. The dog's growl faded. His body stopped trembling. He turned toward her, confused at first, then relaxed. The staff watched in stunned silence as Bruno returned to the paper drawing, circled once, and lay down. Tobias glanced through the window, then back at Nina. "This isn't standard." "No," Nina agreed. "It's not. It's better." After several tense minutes, Tobias left, muttering something about follow-up visits and conditional holds. But the atmosphere at Hollow Creek had changed. The threat had come and passed, and Bruno had stayed grounded. Because Ella was there. The following morning, a small note was taped to the wall outside Kennel 9, not from a staff member, but from Ella. It was written in purple crayon on a yellow sticky note. "Everyone feels broken sometimes, but broken things can be loved too." Sarah found it during her rounds and didn't remove it. She stood there for a moment, reading the words again, before turning away with moist eyes. Later that day, Rachel watched her daughter sit in silence beside Bruno, sunlight filtering through the frosted windows, casting golden beams between them. She whispered to herself, "She's healing him. But I think he's healing her too." The snow had finally stopped falling over Elk Ridge, leaving behind a white silence that blanketed the entire town. The rooftops wore their frosting of ice like old men in wool hats, and a shy winter sun peeked through bare trees. Hollow Creek Shelter stirred awake, with the scent of warm oatmeal, disinfectant, and cautious hope. The morning rounds had just begun, and Kennel 9? Bruno's realm was no longer the war zone it once had been. He now greeted the early shift with ears perked instead of growls, and while his tail didn't wag like a happy puppy's, it didn't tuck in fear either. Rachel stood in the staff room, holding a ceramic mug that read, "Every life counts." Her eyes, dark with wear and softened by exhaustion, drifted to the window where she could see Bruno's kennel. She'd barely slept, debating a choice that everyone around her seemed to question. Just the night before, she had made her decision. She would push for Ella to be allowed inside the kennel, not just to sit near Bruno, but to enter fully under careful supervision. Sarah, ever practical, stood across the table, arms crossed, her silver braid pulled tight down her back. She had reviewed Bruno's file twice, fingers tapping anxiously on the pages. "I get what you're saying," Sarah began, "but if something happens, even one snap your daughter is 10. That's not a wound we can stitch." Rachel met her gaze, unwavering. "And if we don't let her try, we'll never know what that dog could become. We've watched him deteriorate in silence. She's the only one who's made him choose stillness over fear." Sarah sighed, her voice low. "Do you know what happens to a shelter if a child gets bitten on sight?" "I do," Rachel said. "But I also know what happens to dogs who are misunderstood until the end." They reached an agreement, reluctantly. Ella would be allowed into the kennel, but only 5 minutes at a time, under the direct watch of Nina Carver. That afternoon, as the sun glinted against icicles outside, Ella entered the shelter holding her mother's gloved hand. She wore her usual navy blue coat with the missing button, and her backpack thumped softly against her back. Rachel knelt and adjusted the sleeves on Ella's coat. "You don't have to do this," she whispered. Ella looked at her, then over at Bruno, who was already standing, waiting. She simply said, "I want to." Nina stood nearby, holding a clipboard but not writing. She wore black jeans, her boots speckled with salt, and a thick padded vest over a flannel shirt. Her sharp green eyes flicked between dog and girl like a quiet storm. As she unlatched the kennel gate, she crouched down beside Ella. "If he moves too fast, or you feel scared, you step back, understand?" Ella nodded. The gate opened with a soft, metallic click. Bruno didn't lunge. He didn't retreat. He stood, tense but not threatening, his paws firmly planted. Ella stepped inside, slow as moonlight. She didn't speak. Instead, she reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a wooden brush, the kind used for thick coats with wide teeth. She sat cross-legged on the floor and placed it gently between them. Bruno tilted his head. His gaze darted to the brush, then to her, then back again. Nina whispered to Rachel from the side, "This is where it breaks, or begins." Bruno took one step forward, then another. Then he stopped. Ella, unblinking, stretched out her hand, not to touch him, but to slide the brush closer. Bruno sniffed it. Then, slowly, he lowered himself beside her, not touching, not leaning, but present. Ella whispered, "Would it be okay if I brushed just a little?" Rachel watched, heart pounding. Bruno's body didn't tense. His ears twitched, but he stayed still. Ella reached forward, so gently it was more like air than pressure, and ran the brush once along his shoulder. And Bruno closed his eyes. Over the next week, this 5-minute ritual became a daily ceremony. Ella entered. Bruno waited. She brushed. Sometimes she hummed, sometimes she read from her science book, sometimes she said nothing at all. But Bruno let her. More than that, he began to expect her. If she arrived late, he paced. If her voice echoed down the hallway, he would rise before anyone else noticed. One Thursday afternoon, a new presence entered the story. Dr. Louis Brenner, a veterinarian from the regional animal hospital, who had been asked to consult on Bruno's behavioral and physical state. Dr. Brenner was in his early 50s, with a close-cropped beard, soft-spoken demeanor, and glasses that always slid down his nose. He had worked with aggressive rescues before, but had the quiet empathy of someone who'd once needed patience himself. When he arrived, Rachel introduced him to Bruno's case and gently led him to the observation window. He watched as Ella brushed the dog's flank, murmuring a story about a dragon who only roared when it missed someone. "She's not training him," Dr. Brenner said quietly. "She's teaching him that it's safe to exist." He spent the afternoon running non-invasive tests on Bruno blood work, joint mobility, old scar mapping. Bruno didn't growl. He didn't fight. As long as Ella was nearby, he complied with stillness that astounded everyone. Later that evening, Dr. Brenner sat beside Rachel in the staff room. "There's trauma here," he said. "Long-term, but not just physical. He's showing classic signs of grief loss of a person, possibly a home. That, plus sensory overwhelm. And yet, he's regulating. Around her. Rachel nodded, emotion flickering behind her tired eyes. He was gone. Now he's starting to come back. That night, as the shelter closed, Nina approached Ella before she left. "You did well," she said, her voice softer than usual. Ella smiled. "He trusts me now." Nina nodded. "And you trust yourself." By the weekend, the staff began referring to Kennel 9 differently, not as Bruno's cage, but as Bruno's room. They stopped wearing gloves when passing by. They left toys and blankets inside again. And every morning, the little yellow sticky note remained taped on the wall. Broken things can be loved too. It was a crisp Saturday morning in Elkridge when the call came. Rachel was pouring kibble into food bins in the back supply room when the front desk phone rang. Sarah answered as usual, her voice steady and professional, but the tone shifted first surprise, then disbelief, then something like cautious hope. She called Rachel over without taking her eyes off the receiver. "Someone's on the line," Sarah said, her hand covering the mic. "Says he might know Bruno, claims he's his dog, from a year ago." Rachel's pulse quickened. "Did he say how?" "Through a photo, and the microchip number. He's a veteran, name's Walter Green." The name meant nothing to Rachel, but when she heard the man's voice, low, deliberate, and carrying the faint shake of age and emotion, something in her recognized it. Not the voice, but the ache in it. "I believe the dog you call Bruno," Walter said, "is my dog. His name was Max. We served together." Walter Green was a retired Marine Corps medic in his 70s, living in a quiet town called Millbridge, about 30 miles east. His voice held the steady grit of someone used to silence. But as he described the fire, the night his cabin burned down during a suspected break-in, the chaos that followed, the panicked search, the days that bled into weeks, it cracked at the edges. "I thought he was gone," Walter murmured, "but then I saw the article about the dog in Elkridge with the scars." The shelter had made local news after Tobias Finch's visit and Bruno's surprising behavioral turn. A photo in the article showed Bruno resting with his chin on Ella's brush, his scarred side faintly visible. "I'd know that look anywhere," Walter said. "He got that scar when he pulled me out of a ditch in Afghanistan." Rachel and Sarah sat stunned as the story poured out. Walter described mice in detail, his unique notch in the left ear, his distaste for thunderstorms, his strange fondness for strawberry yogurt. Bruno had all of it, even the notch. "We can't promise anything," Sarah finally said. "But maybe you should come." They arranged for Walter to visit the next morning. When Sunday came, it brought a hush of early winter wind and soft light spilling through the shelter windows. Bruno had been uncharacteristically restless. He paced the kennel more than usual, nose twitching, ears raised, tail slightly lowered, not anxious, but expectant. Ella arrived early, bundled in a red sweater and fuzzy scarf. She noticed his pacing and knelt outside the gate. "Are you waiting for something?" she asked softly. Bruno didn't bark. He just looked at her, then back at the hallway, like he was listening for a sound only he could recognize. At 10:03 a.m., Walter Green arrived. He stepped slowly through the doors of Hollow Creek, leaning on a metal cane and wearing a dark green coat with worn elbows. His eyes were blue but faded, like sky seen through smoke. He carried a small canvas bag over one shoulder and a folded photograph in his hand. Rachel greeted him, her voice gentle. "Mr. Green, he's just down this way." They walked together through the corridor, past the kennels where dogs perked up or barked, but not Bruno. Bruno stood utterly still, frozen. His eyes locked on the man's silhouette. Walter stopped outside the gate. He didn't speak immediately. He just looked. Then, as if gathering invisible threads from the past, he knelt with difficulty and placed the photograph on the floor. It showed a younger Walter, sitting on the porch of a weathered cabin, one hand resting on the head of a strong, alert German shepherd with eyes full of purpose. That dog looked exactly like Bruno. The same structure, the same intelligent tension in the muscles, the same furrowed brow. Walter's hand trembled as he reached into his bag and pulled out a battered leather collar, its nameplate still intact, though dulled by time and soot. The name, Max. "You saved me once," Walter said softly. You dragged me out when the RPG landed. I was unconscious. You pulled me through gravel and wire. You never left. Bruno took a step forward. His body was tense but not afraid. Then another step. He sniffed the air, low and deliberate. His tail gave a single twitch. Ella, standing just behind Rachel, whispered, "He knows." Bruno walked to the gate, slowly, deliberately. He looked at Walter, then the photo, then the collar, his ears pressed back, not in aggression, but in confusion, in memory surfacing. Then he turned, padded back to the corner of his kennel, and picked up the crumpled drawing Ella had given him, the one of him standing in a field with her. He brought it forward, placing it next to the collar on the floor. Then he lay down beside both. Everyone stood frozen. Even Walter, eyes glistening, said nothing. After a long pause, he finally knelt again and spoke. "I think you already found someone, haven't you?" Bruno didn't move, but his body relaxed. He looked at Ella, then back at Walter, and rested his chin between the drawing and the old collar bridging two lives. Sarah whispered to Rachel, "He made his choice." Later, over tea in the staff room, Walter told them more about his bond with Max, how he'd trained him as a military K-9, how they returned from deployment together, how Max had once refused to leave his side during a severe illness. After the fire, he searched for weeks, flyers, police reports, hope eroded by silence. Eventually, he believed Max had perished in the blaze. "I'm not here to take him," Walter said, voice thick. "I just wanted to know he was alive, that he wasn't alone." Rachel placed a hand gently on his weathered knuckles. "He's not alone anymore. He found someone who sees him the way you once did." Walter nodded, then reached into his coat again and handed Rachel the collar. "If it's okay, could you keep this with him? Even if he never wears it, it's a part of him, just like she is now." Back in Kennel 9, Bruno lay asleep, the collar and the drawing side by side. And for the first time since arriving at Hollow Creek, he dreamed with all four paws twitching a sign, Nina would later say, of deep trust and rest. Outside, the wind picked up, swirling snow against the windows. But inside, the storm had quieted. The storm rolled in without warning. 1 minute, the streets of Elkridge were bathed in the gold of a winter sunset, and the next, clouds swallowed the sky whole. Wind howled between buildings, bending thin trees like brittle reeds, and rain lashed against windows with a fury that seemed almost personal. At Hollow Creek Shelter, the air turned anxious. The dogs barked more than usual. The old pipes groaned. And inside, Kennel 9, Bruno paced restlessly, his nails clicking against the concrete with each step. Rachel had just finished checking the evening medications when her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and frowned. 2 missed calls from the school. Then a third call came through. It was Ella's teacher, Mrs. Harkins, a woman in her 50s with short silver hair and a kind face lined with years of patient smiles. Her voice was tight. "Rachel, Ella hasn't been picked up yet, and the staff searched. She's not on campus." Rachel's heart stopped. "She was supposed to walk straight home," she whispered. Her car keys fell to the floor in her panic. She scooped them up and ran, coat half-buttoned, into the storm. Rain drenched her in seconds. As she reached the shelter's front door, her phone rang again. This time, it was Officer Brad Coleman, a local patrol cop who often stopped by the shelter on weekends with dog biscuits and quiet jokes. He was in his late 30s, stocky with a round face, buzz-cut hair, and the kind of calm voice that could ease a room. "We've dispatched a unit, Rachel," he said. "Library's been checked. A neighbor saw her walking alone toward the west end. We'll keep you posted." Rachel burst into the shelter, dripping, breathless. "Ella's missing," she gasped. "She never made it home." Sarah, standing by the office window, dropped the file in her hands. The storm god. Behind them, a low, guttural sound echoed through the shelter. Bruno. He stood in his kennel, still as a statue, ears up, eyes locked on Rachel. Then he did something he hadn't done in weeks. He growled deep and insistent, but not in anger. It was a call, a demand. Rachel stepped toward the kennel. Bruno's body tensed, muscles coiling beneath his scarred fur. He pawed the door, not violently, but with urgency. "He knows," she whispered. Nina appeared at the hallway corner, pulling on her coat. "You trust him?" "I don't have time not to," Rachel said, unlocking the kennel gate without hesitation. Bruno bolted out, not with aggression, but with laser focus. He didn't look around, didn't sniff at the other dogs. He went straight to the exit, tail low, head forward. Rachel snapped a leash on him, grabbed a flashlight, and followed. The rain blurred everything. Visibility was no more than a few feet ahead, and puddles formed faster than boots could avoid them. Bruno pulled hard, not out of panic, but direction. His nose to the wind, cutting through alleyways and side streets with uncanny certainty. They passed shuttered storefronts, glowing porch lights, and flickering street lamps. Every so often, he paused to sniff a corner, then bolted again, forcing Rachel to jog despite the weight of her soaked clothes. They crossed into the industrial district, where warehouses loomed like sleeping giants. Rachel's legs ached, her lungs burned, but Bruno kept going until finally he stopped at the rusted gate of a long-abandoned auto shop. He barked once, sharp and clear, then scratched at the gate, whining. Rachel shoved it open. Bruno rushed inside. Under the broken overhang, huddled beneath an old sheet of corrugated tin, was Ella. She was curled into herself, knees drawn up, her red sweater soaked, hair plastered to her face. One lens of her glasses was cracked, her lip was split, and her left palm was scraped, blood mixing with rain. "Ella!" Rachel cried, dropping beside her. The girl blinked slowly, dazed. "I slipped. Tried to take the shortcut behind the train tracks. I thought I could beat the storm." Rachel wrapped her arms around her daughter and held her like she'd never let go. Bruno sat down beside them, body shielding Ella from the wind. He didn't make a sound, just pressed close, eyes scanning the shadows as if daring the night to try again. Officer Coleman's cruiser arrived moments later, headlights slicing through the dark. He jumped out, soaked within seconds, and radioed for paramedics. "We've got her," he said, breath catching as he saw the dog standing sentinel. "Damn! He led you here?" Rachel nodded, tears streaking her rain-slicked cheeks. He didn't even hesitate. At the clinic, Ella was treated for mild hypothermia and superficial wounds. Rachel never left her side. And Bruno? He refused to leave the doorway. When a nurse tried to shoo him away, Ella spoke her first full sentence since arriving. "He stays." The nurse, a woman named Linda with curly blonde hair and a disarming smile, looked at Rachel, then down at Bruno. "All right, soldier," she said gently. "You're on duty." Bruno curled up by the door, head on his paws, eyes never closing. He didn't sleep. He didn't eat. He simply waited. By morning, the rain had passed, leaving the world silver and still. Ella sat up in bed, blanket wrapped around her, and looked at Rachel. "I was scared," she said. Rachel brushed the hair from her daughter's face. "I was too." "But he wasn't," Ella added. "He found me." Back at the shelter, the news spread like wildfire. Staff, volunteers, even the mayor heard about the rescue. Sarah stood by Kennel 9 that afternoon, staring at the empty space where Bruno once paced endlessly. She smiled to herself. "Guess we found our hero," she murmured. That night, as the shelter lights dimmed, Bruno finally slept, not alone in a kennel, but beside Ella, curled up at the foot of her bed under a soft flannel blanket, his body finally at ease. The snow had melted into soft puddles that glistened beneath the weak sunlight of early spring. Elkridge, still blanketed in frost at its edges, had begun to stir from winter's quiet grip. For weeks now, conversations in diners, schools, and even church halls all centered around one name. Not a politician, not a teacher, not even a celebrity, but a dog, a scarred, once feared German shepherd named Bruno. The rescue of Ella in the middle of the storm had sparked something larger than anyone expected. The local paper, the Elkridge Chronicle, ran a front-page story titled, "From Danger to Guardian: The Dog Who Found a Lost Girl." The photo showed Bruno standing beside Ella's hospital bed, alert and noble, his coat still damp and eyes unwavering. By the following week, larger outlets picked up the story. A camera crew from Denver arrived, led by a young woman named Cassie Vu, a Vietnamese-American field reporter in her late 20s with sharp eyes and a warm, grounded energy. She wore jeans, a weatherproof jacket, and carried a notepad full of quotes written in hurried loops. Her voice when she interviewed Rachel and Ella was calm, but carried the kind of sincerity that made people want to open up. Cassie crouched beside Ella outside Hollow Creek, where a crowd had begun to gather. "What made you trust Bruno, even when others didn't?" she asked gently. Ella, shy as always, shrugged. He looked how I feel sometimes. People think something's wrong with you, so they don't give you a chance. Bruno, seated beside her, nudged her hand gently with his nose. Ella smiled and added, "But he always gave me a chance." The footage aired 2 nights later. The comments flooded in, thousands of them. Messages of support, offers to donate, even notes from veterans who had worked with K-9 units. Hollow Creek's inbox overflowed. Sarah, initially skeptical of all the attention, now spent her evenings sorting emails with a red pen and her glasses slipping down her nose. Her fingers were stiff from arthritis, but there was a spark in her that hadn't been there in years. "I thought I'd seen every kind of rescue story," she admitted one morning, sipping her chamomile tea at the front desk. "But I've never seen one rescue so many hearts at once." Meanwhile, Mayor Alan Beasley, a tall man in his 60s with a full beard, cowboy boots, and a fondness for bolo ties, called a meeting with the city council. A former police officer turned civil servant, Alan had a long-standing relationship with Hollow Creek, having adopted his own golden retriever, Rusty, from there 5 years prior. He proposed something no one had expected, a public recognition ceremony. "We've given plaques to Eagle Scouts and trophies to chili cook-off winners," he said, voice booming. "But this time, we give honor to loyalty, to instinct, and to the kind of quiet courage that saves lives." The town park, nestled between the elementary school and the post office, was chosen for the ceremony. A small stage was assembled, with folding chairs arranged beneath budding trees and a simple banner stretched across the top, celebrating our guardian, Bruno. The day of the event arrived under a pale sky dusted with spring haze. Dozens of townspeople came, shelter volunteers, school teachers, firemen, librarians, and children with hand-drawn signs. Rachel helped Ella adjust the collar on her light blue dress, while Bruno stood calmly in his new harness, cleaned and polished, but still bearing the slight fray of past trials. Nina stood off to the side, arms crossed but proud, wearing her only non-flannel blouse. Even Dr. Brenner made the drive from Boulder, bringing with him a small engraved tag wrapped in a velvet pouch. Sarah, in her long beige coat, stood behind the podium, clearing her throat with the practiced nerves of someone more used to barking orders than giving speeches. "We've all met Bruno," she began, "some of us on the worst day of his life, and others on the best. He came to us with scars we could see and deeper ones we couldn't. He tore through fences. He tore through fear. But he never tore through the one thing that never gave up on him: love." A hush fell across the crowd. Then Mayor Beasley stepped forward, holding a small gold medallion shaped like a heart. Etched into it were the words, "To Bruno, protector, companion, hero." Ella was called to the stage. Her hands trembled slightly, but her eyes didn't waver. She stood beside Bruno as the mayor leaned down and clipped the medal onto his collar. "He didn't just save my daughter," Rachel said into the microphone, her voice steady but brimming with emotion. "He saved the part of her that was starting to disappear. And I think he saved a piece of all of us, too." Applause erupted. Bruno didn't bark, didn't flinch. He just stood there, beside Ella, tail swaying gently, as if he understood. After the ceremony, children came forward to pet him. Bruno sat patiently, even lowering his head for one timid boy who whispered, "You're my favorite superhero." Behind them, Sarah wiped her glasses for the 3rd time and muttered, "Dust, must be spring." That evening, after the crowd had dispersed and the sun dipped low, Rachel, Ella, and Bruno sat beneath one of the maple trees still budding in green. A breeze rolled through, carrying the scent of fresh soil and new beginnings. Ella leaned her head against Bruno's side. "Do you think he knows?" she asked her mother. "That he's our hero?" Rachel looked at the dog, his scars, his quiet eyes, the way he listened even when no one spoke. "I think he doesn't need to," she replied, "because he already feels it." Bruno let out a low sigh, not of weariness but contentment, and lay his head in Ella's lap. The little girl who once didn't speak much now hummed quietly, brushing his ears with her fingers, her own kind of medal ceremony. The days in Elkridge grew longer, and spring began to settle like a warm sigh across the town. Buds unfurled into blossoms, children returned to playgrounds without their winter coats, and the whisper of new beginnings drifted on the breeze. Hollow Creek Shelter had never been quieter or more full of life. Bruno no longer lived behind bars. His kennel, once called Kennel 9, now stood empty, but not with the sadness of absence. Instead, a small wooden sign hung on the door that read, "Reserved for Miracles." Inside was a plush dog bed, a faded drawing of a German shepherd under a tree, and the words, "Thank you for finding me." Bruno had officially been adopted by Rachel and Ella 2 weeks after the ceremony in the park. The paperwork had been simple, but the moment itself had felt monumental. Ella had knelt beside him in the front lobby, clutching a small stuffed bear in one hand, and whispered, "You're home now." Bruno's tail had wagged twice. At home, he adjusted quickly. Rachel's modest house on the edge of town had a fenced backyard, a porch with a rocking chair, and a view of the hills that turned lavender at sunset. Bruno claimed the space beside Ella's bed on the very first night, and from that moment, he never slept anywhere else. Not even once. Ella herself was changing in ways no one expected. The girl who once spoke in whispers now raised her hand in class. She joined the school's nature club and volunteered to read out loud during morning announcements. Her teachers noticed first particularly Ms. Calder, her 4th grade homeroom teacher. A tall woman in her early 40s with wild auburn curls and a bright, enthusiastic energy, Ms. Calder called Rachel after school one afternoon. "I don't know what happened," she said, "but your daughter is glowing. She even smiled during math." Rachel laughed softly. "I think she just needed someone to believe in her. Someone who didn't speak a word." One of Ella's first projects back at school was a painting larger than anything she'd made before. On a canvas nearly as tall as she was, she painted Bruno in a field of wildflowers. His eyes were deep and soulful, his body relaxed, his head slightly tilted as if listening to a song only he could hear. Above him, she painted a string of words in gentle script. "Not all wounds need words. Some only need time and love." The painting was displayed in the town library, and over time, it became more than just a piece of student art. People came to see it. Children who had trouble speaking, adults who had trouble letting go. The shelter received letters from neighboring towns, asking if Bruno did therapy visits, or if the shelter had other dogs that understood. One Saturday morning, Rachel brought Bruno and Ella to visit the Elkridge Haven, a small assisted living center near the edge of town. It was a brick building surrounded by bird feeders and soft gardens, home to about 20 residents. The visit was informal, a simple meet and greet organized by Ms. Linda Howe, a retired nurse and now the activity director. Linda was in her 60s, short and sprightly with silver hair pulled into a tidy bun and a warm voice that reminded people of fresh muffins. When Bruno entered the common room, the change in atmosphere was immediate. A woman in a wheelchair who rarely spoke reached out to touch his ears. A man who hadn't smiled in weeks chuckled when Bruno gently nudged his hand. And when Ella told the story of how he found her in the storm, the entire room leaned in, not for the drama, but for the healing. "He didn't bark," Ella told them. "He just sat with me, like he was saying, 'I'm not leaving.'" Linda dabbed her eyes and whispered to Rachel, "You don't know how rare this is?" Rachel nodded. "I think I'm starting to." Later that afternoon, Ella and Bruno sat beneath a cherry tree in the Haven's garden, while residents watched from their windows. Ella held a notebook in her lap and sketched in silence. Rachel stood nearby, arms crossed, heart full. Sarah joined her, arriving in a tan coat and her familiar practical boots. She held a folder under one arm, but didn't open it. "I've seen dozens of adoptions," she said, "and I never doubted that dogs heal. But this is the first time I've seen one heal an entire town." Rachel smiled. "He wasn't just rescued. He became something more." That evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, Ella curled up beside Bruno on the living room rug, reading aloud a chapter from a book about wolves and wilderness. Her voice was steady, clear, and every so often, she would stop to glance at Bruno as if to make sure he was still listening. He always was. As Rachel tidied the kitchen, she noticed something Bruno had started doing over the past week. Whenever the wind picked up outside, he would walk to the front door and sit quietly, ears twitching, eyes thoughtful. Not as if he wanted to leave, but as if he remembered what it meant to be lost, and how much it mattered to be found. Later that night, Ella taped a new note to the fridge. It was written in blue ink, slightly crooked, but full of her careful handwriting. It said, "He was broken, so was I. Now we're both just whole." And that was where the story ended, not with a dramatic moment, but with a gentle truth. Healing doesn't always arrive with noise. Sometimes it arrives on four paws, with scars that don't scare you away, but invite you in. Bruno's story would be told many times over. In classrooms, in newspaper articles, in the mural that Ella would one day paint on the wall of Hollow Creek Shelter. But the heart of it, the quiet center of the storm, was always the same. Love doesn't need language. It only needs someone willing to listen. The biggest lesson Bruno left us is this: sometimes the most wounded hearts are the ones most capable of love. All they need is someone willing to sit quietly beside them. And in our own lives, maybe we pass by too many people, or even animals, just because we don't understand their silence. If this story moved you, please like the video. Share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more true stories that heal. And tell me in the comments, have you ever felt like someone saw through your silence and chose to stay?